Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 26th, 2011, and my guest is Roy Baumeister, the Francis Epps Professor of Social Psychology at Florida State University. Roy, welcome to EconTalk.
I'm glad to be here.
Our topic for today is your book with the title, Is There Anything Good About Men? We're hoping that's a rhetorical question, we men. It's an incredibly thought-provoking book on the differences between men and women and how culture shapes both sexes. I want to start with the psychology literature that you open up with and the perspective that social scientists have had towards men and women and their differences or similarities. And you talk early in the book about there's been a radical and sudden change about relative superiority of men and women. Talk about what happened there.
Well, I think for a long time there was an assumption that men were the proper human beings and women were sort of an inferior copy. And the question was, could women be almost as good as men, and so on. And then there was a brief period of arguing there were no differences, that they were equal. But since about 1980, almost all the literature on gender differences either says women are better, or some say there's still no differences. But it's become sort of taboo to see men as superior in any way. Now, I look at things that the world is more built on trade-offs, and any lasting difference, it's likely to be because of a trade-off. So being better at one thing is likely to be connected to being not as good at something else. So it doesn't really seem plausible that nature would have made one gender all around better than the other. More likely it will preserve the differences if one is better for one thing and one is better for something else.
Yeah, I like what you said about trade-offs. As an economist, of course, we deal a lot in trade-offs. I think it was Thomas Sowell who said, the essence of economics is there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And early on in your book, you explicitly say that we're typically looking for the best alternative, the best option, the solution, and neglecting the fact that there usually means we have to sacrifice something, we have to give up something.
Yeah, I think that's routinely true. And so men and women might be different because they are suited or bred for different purposes or different kinds of social interactions or something like that. But it doesn't seem likely that one's going to be all around better than the other. So it's really the biases and pressures and political correctnesses of the time that insist when you have an idea that one gender is all around better than the other.
What are some of the dimensions that psychologists have looked at when they come to these conclusions? What are the issues that people care about in that literature?
You mean
that women are better? I know that one issue we're going to talk about later is social skills. That they argue that a lot of people argue women are more social than men. What are some of the other dimensions that women are allegedly superior to men and ignoring trade-offs?
Okay, being more social is an important one. I think being less aggressive and competitive and all those things. I think there's just a general assumption that it would be better if men were more like women. And even the psychology of men's groups and the American Psychological Association say there's a lot of assumption that men should somehow change to be more like women. But
more empathetic, express themselves better, show their feelings, cry more, those kind of things.
Yes, all those things, yes.
One of the issues that is under the surface of your book, and you don't really talk about, I hear those things myself. I cry at movies from time to time. I'm proud of it, and it's politically correct given that theme. But I wonder how much those mores really affect how we ultimately, say, raise our children and turn out. It is in the air, this idea that men should, quote, be more like women or more feminine or the world should be more egalitarian. Do you think it matters that much? Or do we just is that just cheap talk from academics who do talk about it a lot?
My sense is we really have changed the way we bring up children. It's a much more girl-centered environment. I didn't have as much contact with the schools, but when my wife goes there and so on, she says, well, it seems like with each decision they have to make, if there's one way that's better for boys and one way that's better for girls, they feel like, well, it'd be sexist to do it the way that's better for boys, so we'll just do this one the way that's better for girls. And over, all those decisions get made like that, and especially girls are more desired as students there. They mature a little bit faster, which is another interesting trade-off, actually.
Absolutely.
I think, but
undeniably true, by the way. Anyone who's ever looked at anyone under the age of 20 or been under the age of 20.
Yes.
One example of that, of course, is the use of pharmaceutical products in the classroom. The whole attention deficit disorder phenomenon, I assume, is a male phenomenon overwhelmingly.
Yes, I believe it. I mean, both genders can have it, but it is, I think, more male, and it is a problem. A lot of boys are just medicated for, the critics say they're just being medicated for being boys. But
the defenders
it is
say
a little harder for an energetic boy to sit still and focus in a classroom and so on. And so again, the women generally run the schools, and they're making the decisions, and the girls are the better students, and they're trying, quite earnestly to be fair to both, but each time it seems, well, we should do it the way that's better for girls. And so we end up kind of raising our boys like girls, which is probably not going to produce the best results.
Well, we also, I think, have pushed our girls to be more like boys, too. It's an interesting phenomenon, right? We've tried to, women are pushed much more towards athletics today than they were 50 years ago, and more towards the more physical athletics than they were 50 years ago. So there's just more, girls are more active, K through 12 in the school system, which seems like a good thing.
Yes.
Of course, many of these things we're going to talk about also have their own trade-offs, their benefits and costs to them. Let's move to career activity. You have some very interesting things to say about two areas where men dominate. And, of course, the debate is over why they dominate. And those two areas are mathematics and jazz improv. And you talk in the book, and there's also a great essay, speech you gave on this, a lecture that we'll put a link up to, that was the first I saw of some of the ideas in the book. You start talking about Larry Summers, who got in a little trouble I'm being ironic when I say little. He got in a lot of trouble at Harvard. He was president, and he speculated, if I remember correctly, it wasn't a bold statement. It was a speculation that it was possible that the frequency of male success in mathematics and sciences was perhaps genetic. Is that a correct summary of what he said?
Yeah, I think he said just there might be more men with really high ability, and there was this huge outpouring of indignation and objections to what he said. And it turned out there are more males at both extremes of the IQ distribution. Males are just more genetically variable. So he was on very solid scientific ground. I think people took it that he was implying that men were smarter than women on the whole, but on that, it's not what he was saying. The average could be precisely the same if you have more men at both extremes. Then you'll have more men at the high end, and that seems to be what just about every large-scale study shows when you look at distributions of intelligence. It's one of the themes of the book. Men go to extremes much more than women, probably for biological as well as for social reasons.
And one of the things I found interesting about that is that when we look at historical outcomes for men and women, a lot of women like to point out correctly that men are in positions of power, they're positions of dominance, they get much of the swag from tyranny and other historically unpleasant events. But you point out they also are at the bottom in greater frequency. Yes,
if you look at who's in prison, who's homeless, who's killed on the job, even now we got equal numbers of men and women working, but still something like 93-94% of deaths on the job are men.
That's because they're stupid and careless, Roy. Sorry, we're going to keep that tone out of this podcast. But obviously, there are many explanations for why that could be true. But the most apparently, it's because they do the more dangerous jobs.
That's right. Yes, and that contributes to the higher salary thing. But even the higher salary thing could be just there are more men at both extremes, since you don't have salaries don't all go all the way down into the negative numbers, so that the real extremely low quality males can't pull the male average down. Only the high achieving ones pull it up. Yeah,
the higher proportion of homeless, for example, those should be negatives or low numbers, but since they're not in the data, you don't observe even the zeros, let alone the negatives, whatever you want to call it, a negative. So why is it that, let's assume obviously it's hard to measure, but if we assume that the averages are the same, but just the male distribution has fatter tails, the two extremes, more on the ends and less in the middle, why might that be? Do you have speculation on that?
Speculation. I should say I've been corrected on this a couple of times. I go around saying that the mean is the same, and in practical purposes it's pretty close. But the real experts on intelligence come around and say, well, in adulthood there is a tiny difference, that the male is slightly higher than the female.
In measured IQ tests?
On IQ tests, but it's such a small difference as to be trivial. The more meaningful difference is the greater difference at the extremes. My sense is it goes with the different rates of reproduction, that in essence males are nature's way of rolling the dice, because if you think of it constantly experimenting to try a new variation or a new mutation, most of those experiments will turn out badly. Every so often you'll have one that will turn out well and move the species forward. So you want the bad ones to be flushed out of the gene pool right away and not reproduce, whereas you want the good ones to reproduce a lot. And male reproductive variance is like that. In other words, some men have no children at all, and some men have a lot of children, whereas women tend to cluster in the middle. Relatively few women throughout history have had no children at all. Certainly fewer women than men have gone childless. And at the opposite extreme, there are men who've had hundreds, even thousands of children, and of course, no woman can do that.
The example you give in the book is Genghis Khan, a slightly unpalatable thought that he perhaps fathered thousands, if I remember correctly.
Yes, thousands of children. He was a busy guy.
So we are many of us in the world alive today are disproportionately related to Genghis Khan than, say, his cousin, who was a lot less ambitious. You refer to a DNA study on that, and the proportions are rather striking about how many of our ancestors are women versus men. You assume it's 50-50. Of course, we each had a father and a mother, as you point out in the book.
Yes, that's the assumption that the ancestors of today's human race would be half women and half men. I think that's what people assume.
It's a trick question.
The DNA research came out a few years ago and said, well, no, it's twice as many women as men. Now, laypersons tend to be surprised because they thought it should have been 50-50, and they have a hard time understanding how it could be unequal. But when you talk to biologists and people like that, they're surprised the difference isn't bigger, because in many species, 20% of the males but 90% of the females will reproduce. You get the situation where the males fight to the top, and then the alpha male goes and mates with all the females in the group, so that the females will have a child or a baby of whatever it is each season with whoever happens to be the top male. And in human history, the same sorts of things. Polygamy has been the norm in more societies than not. It's only the last couple centuries that we've begun to insist on monogamy, which, in my understanding, is essentially a way of spreading the women around so that every man can have a woman. That equalizes things much, so that will drive, in the long run, the number of our ancestors toward closer to 50-50. That's probably why it's 2-to-1 now rather than 4 or 5-to-1, what it might have been in the more distant past.
Yeah, there's a standard, I think, cultural view that polygamy is bad for women, but of course it's really bad for men because most of them won't be able to get a spouse. The worst men, the least competitive men, are not going to get to marry. And
yes, it's hard to make out how polygamy itself is bad for women.
Well,
it's sometimes mixed up with other things. But even a woman who wants to have a single husband all to herself, she's still better off in a polygamous society because there'll be such a surplus of single men.
Right. People say, yeah, but you wouldn't want to be the fourth wife of a great man. Well, evidently some did in those days. They preferred
to be.
Yeah,
I could think there are probably some women around today who'd rather be Bill Gates' third wife than, say, the only wife of an assistant manager of a convenience store or something like that.
Or an assistant professor. A term that you cleverly point out is not the most, it's a slightly demeaning term. It's kind of interesting.
Yes, yeah, it's too bad.
But I want to go back to this issue of eventually we're going to get back to women in jazz, which we'll get back to. But I want to talk a little bit more first about the competitive role in nature, throwing away the the losing rolls of the dice, the bad rolls. So if you have a culture through much of human history, particularly what we would call primitive or prehistoric times, where a handful of the top men are reproducing at a very high rate, and many of the men are not reproducing at all. Over time, what that does is it selects for men who are, what are their traits going to likely be? Because you use that a lot.
Yes, well, to get to the top, the man has to dominate other men. He has to rise in the social structure according to whatever its rules are. So it's going to certainly select for ambition, competitiveness,
aggressiveness,
even aggressiveness through much of history, of course. Physical domination
violence,
was the important way. All those traits would be prominent in a way that they didn't count in women. You know that in a man, remember, nature measures success by how many offspring you have, and so the ambitious, competitive, aggressive men were rewarded generation after generation with having more children than the mild, meek, submissive, go-along ones. Whereas in women, there was no such differential rewarding. Remember, in many animals, all the females reproduce. So there isn't that much need to have traits. There certainly isn't need to fight your way to the top of a hierarchy or outsmart others or anything like that.
So those passive men, the less ambitious, less aggressive, less physically strong, they're going to be they're going to fall relentlessly, and over time they're going to fall out of the gene pool. In a way, it's amazing how many quiet, passive, unaggressive people there are in the world overall. Then, given that, right, it's one of the challenges to that theory. Those should have been we should all be Genghis Khan-like and less like the assistant professors I know. Yes.
Well, remember, only the traits that are really tied to gender will be selected in this way. Certainly there's genetic aspects of personality that are not on the same chromosome or what have you that dictate which gender you are. So males and females will share some traits, but when there is a gender-linked trait, it will tend to produce that difference, yes.
Because the women alive today are also the descendants of Genghis Khan, right? So
that is true, yes.
Why aren't they more aggressive? Why didn't, because of that genetic disproportion that where our ancestors are more male than female, isn't that going to push, I don't know much genetics, obviously, I'm going to embarrass myself now, but doesn't that mean we're going to have women steadily becoming more like men as because of that ratio?
No, that doesn't, and I'm not a genetic expert either, so maybe we shouldn't go too far in trying to spell this out. But nature is capable of having gender-linked personality traits. And so a woman might carry a trait, even for male baldness. I am told, and I can't vouch for this, I'm told that if if a man go bald, it's not from your father, it's from your mother's father. So the women are there carrying a physical trait, in this case, that only shows up in the male. She doesn't go bald.
Right.
But her son may get that trait and go bald. And in the same way, then, the male aggressiveness that Genghis Khan passed on to the women he had, well, his daughters might have carried some of that trait, but it may not have shown up or not as much in their own behavior, but then come out in their sons, since women aren't really biologically bred and selected for fighting other women in a way that males, not just humans but many species, yes, they're men. Like heard Jim Dabbs, who died a few years ago, who wrote a really authoritative book on testosterone. He remarked once that, to put it simply, the female body is designed to breed and care for children. The male body is designed to fight and kill other men.
Kind of sums it up.
Yeah, it's overstating it a little bit, but
Yeah.
I think is a very succinct summary of the difference. I mean, that's why in the domestic violence literature, for example, pretty much the heavy weight of evidence suggests that women do, if anything, they're more likely to hit their partners. As a small, women are more violent toward their romantic partners than men are, but they don't do as much damage. It's the male men battering their wives that causes the social problem, because a woman hits her husband, and sometimes she will. It is an underappreciated problem, and certainly when she uses a gun or a knife or something,
yeah,
she can do damage. But
she can add capital to her innate skills to be more effective.
But in the two, if they get into a fist fight, the woman usually comes out second best because, again, the male body is much better designed for it. You were commenting on women going into sports, but we're not seeing the big rush into boxing. It's
a little bit, not much.
That's not going to be equal anytime soon.
Correct. And the same is true of the more physically demanding sports, football, any of them actually. Almost, they're not going to be able to compete with men at the same level, obviously, because of those raw physical differences. Well,
they don't even compete with each other on those. I mean, most sports are just women against women. There are very few sports where women compete directly against men. Even pool and chess and some of those, in many cases, they have gender separated. But whereas women will have their own soccer teams and baseball teams and so forth, they don't seem to put together the most dangerous sports, as in boxing and football.
Yeah. Perhaps sign of their superiority, or certainly their wisdom.
I think that, again, it's partly the sign that a society regards males as more expendable, and we don't seem to mind that much that the injuries that many of our young men suffer that often carry with them for the rest of their lives, that they will obtain from playing football, things like that.
Yeah, no, it's literally a brutal sport, but the long run consequences are particularly brutal, and there's some sensitivity to it these days. There's a lot of talk about concussions, and boxing is less fashionable. It's part of the general cultural trend we talked about earlier, I think, that the things that are particularly manly are not as popular as they once were. Football is, but boxing is not, and we are relentlessly moving football toward a less physical game through equipment and through rules and rule changes, obviously, are trying to make it a less aggressive game.
They are trying.
It's hard,
always a question as to whether the safety equipment makes it more or less dangerous.
Well, I think it makes it more dangerous, actually.
Reading an article in The Economist some years ago when somebody died from a boxing match, and they said, well, if you wanted to make boxing safer, you should get rid of the boxing gloves.
Yeah, right. The gloves are supposed to reduce the impact, but
yeah, they reduce the wear and tear on your hand, but then because of that, you can hit the head much harder.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that if we got rid of football helmets, it would be a safer sport because people would act differently. That's the so-called Peltzman Effect. We interviewed Sam Peltzman here. We'll put a link up to that podcast, but I think it's a real effect. One of the issues we haven't mentioned, which I think you talk about with real eloquence, is risk-taking. We talked about aggression, ambition, but you said historically it's the men who get in the boat and go off to conquer another world because they're having trouble dominating the men around them. They figure they'll go do something heroic. They'll go do something at least on different territory. So that aspect of competitiveness is historically quite important, and women don't do it.
Yes, remember again, biology rewards success by giving you more offspring. Well, the women throughout our history, pretty much playing it safe is a valid strategy. Most women are going to be able to reproduce, so it's just a matter of playing it safe and trying to make sure you get a good offer, or you pick the better genes to mix yours with, things like that. Whereas the males, you're facing a dead end biologically. Most males are not, so you got to play some angle. You got to try something new. Sailing off into the unknown, you might get killed, but you might come back rich. And we tend to be descended from the ones who did take the chance and who were lucky and successful and managed to come back rich. The ones who drowned or whatever, they left no traits, no heirs. But would have been probably the same if they had just stayed at home in a minor role. They wouldn't have reproduced either. So they were taken
Now, the skeptics would say those differences are, there might be some genetic difference, but the cultural aspects are huge, so that the patriarchy over time oppressed women, kept them down, gave them these attitudes, encouraged them to be passive, punished them punish them for being aggressive. We still see this today in politics when female politicians throw angry fits. They get it. There's an alleged double standard. So what about this argument that it's our culture historically that has caused these differences between men and women's risk-taking and aggressiveness?
Well, culture tends to build on nature. I'm trying to, in my book, I wanted to understand why the patriarchal difference got started. Most of the anthropologists subscribe to the view that the hunter-gatherers are pretty egalitarian in terms of men and female, males and females being roughly equal in terms of their status and their position and their contribution. I guess the men contribute a little bit more in terms of the total calories that everyone gets, but the men as hunters, it's much more variable. Some days you come home with a feast, and some days you come home with nothing. Whereas the women gathering berries and things, that's always there. So they're more reliable, and the two are equal. So what produced the difference? This idea that the history of culture is all about men oppressing women, I think is a very one-sided and not all that well-supported view that's really been pushed or foisted on us more for political reasons than based on a thoughtful understanding of the facts. So my sense is what happened is hunters and gatherers had separate spheres, the male sphere and the female sphere, organized along the lines that the way men relate to each other and the way women relate to each other, which for the men, they tend to build the bigger networks of shallower relationships, whereas the women make the more intense, close relationship, one-to-one bonds. Cultural progress, however, grows much better from the bigger networks of shallow relationships rather than from the small one. And so what I think happened, rather than this idea that the men banded together and decided, well, let's oppress women and push them down, actually the net effect of the men was to bring women up. It's just the men pushed themselves forward more rapidly. It's that progress and the creation of human culture essentially emerged from the men's sphere. And the history of cultural progress is mostly groups of men competing against other men. It's not men against women. So progress was created and the men raised their sphere, whereas in the women's sphere, in the one-to-one relationships, there was very little progress. If you want to go through the history of the world and look for things that groups of men or groups of women have done, there are far more contributions by groups of men. And, the women are busy doing other important things. And as I said, the intimate relationships are more important, but women don't tend to cooperate in large groups with other women. They don't band together except now and then to complain about the men. But they don't do it. The small business data even today show the same thing. Women are starting more small businesses than men, but they don't grow them into big businesses. If you look at the ones that become the Fortune 500 corporations, or even well below that, but still quite large organizations, then the men are doing that. And that, again, shows the complementary roles and the different emphases. It's easy for my colleagues, as we were talking about earlier, to look at men and say, well, the men should be more like women. It'd be better to show your feelings more and communicate more and be really deeply involved in intimate relationships and care mostly about that. Well, we have women who do that, and yes, there are some rewards if men did that too, but there's a trade-off between the kind of traits you need to build a strong, intimate relationship and the kind of traits you need to negotiate your way around a large group or corporation or whatever, where you've got enemies and rivals and other things. Expressing your feelings is a classic one of that.
Costly
if
strategy.
You're building an intimate relationship, sharing your feelings is one of the best things. It helps your partner know you better and know what you care about and so on, so that the person who loves you can take care of you better. But if you go, well, you mentioned economics, if you're going to buy a used car or a house or something, if you show all your feelings right away, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. And likewise, if, it's a boardroom meeting where you're trying to argue who's going to get the deal, if you've given away all your feelings and shown all your feelings, your rivals can take advantage of you and exploit you there. So it's probably useful for the males in their sphere to keep their feelings a little bit more under wraps and not show them and not reveal them as fast. intimate relationship, but that's not the only criterion. And again, the large group things tend to be very much male things, and that's what's brought culture forward. And ultimately, as I said, that's what lifted women up too. I think this idea of history is all about men pushing women down has been, I'm not going to say it never happened, but it's been way overstated. Women, century after century, were better off than their predecessors because of the advances that the men made. It's just the culture was created by men, and that's why men dominated it and have the top roles in it and so forth.
That's a great point about a statistic I always talk about is the enormous, extraordinary reduction in death in childbirth. Maternal mortality is one of the great human successes, that reduction. And of course,
yes.
Go ahead.
And that was the work of men. I mean, women had managed childbirth for centuries and centuries with men totally excluded. But when the men finally were permitted to get involved in it, they were able to come up with some ways to make it better, safer for mother and child.
Now, this gives me my segue to go back to our the jazz issue, and then I want to take it back forward. We'll come back and talk about some of the literal. There's some actual economics in your book, which is very well done on trade and exchange and specialization. So I want to come back to that, but I want to ask you about the jazz issue. You, unlike the math issue, so we look at the data, we see an enormous preponderance of male success versus female in the high end of mathematics and in the high end of jazz music. So they're great female jazz singers, but there are virtually no jazz musicians that are considered great who are women. And you suggest that that's not an example of, say, extreme ability where the right-hand tail of the distribution is what gets sampled, but rather a preference difference. Explain that.
Yes, let me start with a more general point. Much of the discussion of gender differences has really become acrimonious, poisoned by the idea of who's better, and are men better or women better. And so there's all this talk about ability differences, and is there any difference? And you mentioned earlier the Larry Summers thing: is are boys better at math, or they have better scientific ability, or better intelligence overall, and stuff like that? And I said, well, the differences, if they're there, are in ability, are small, but the differences in motivation, in what you like and want and feel, those differences are much bigger. We've now had since the book came out, several major scholarly works on the gender differences in the sciences, and they pretty much come down to what I was already saying and suspecting when I wrote the book, which is that it's not a difference in ability; it's a difference in motivation. Girls can do science just fine, but they don't like it. It doesn't attract them as much. Studying, I have a female colleague who calls it the dead world. The sciences that study inanimate things like physics and chemistry and so on. That just seems to have less appeal to women. They start to get interested when it's biology, when there's some degree of life, but much more when there are people. Women are fascinated by people. In psychology, we've certainly got plenty of women, and indeed more female than male majors at most colleges right now. But that it's the interest and not the ability that drives that. Now with creativity, and we were talking to bring it back to the point of jazz. The psychology of creativity is a field that's been going there for a long time, and they have all sorts of tests. And as far as I can make out, on those tests, boys and girls, men and women are equally creative. There's not any big gender difference. And then you have to stack that up with, well, in the history of the world, so much creative innovation has been by male, so much more than by female. And jazz being a case in point, that it wasn't access to musical instruments. It isn't even the ability to play, because if you go, say, to classical music, there are women at the very highest levels who will play, superbly, wonderfully, really master an instrument to the highest levels of virtuosity. If there's any difference, some will say that the male hand being slightly larger, so you can hit one note farther away on the piano when you're playing. Tiny little things like that. But
Bela Davidovich can play the piano just fine.
But yes, women play the instruments, but at the creative parts, improvising in jazz and also composing. Throughout the history of the world, most of the great composers have been male. So there seems to be, I'm suggesting the abilities are the same. There's simply a lack of interest in doing that. You talked about the usual excuses that people make. Well, maybe women weren't encouraged, or they were oppressed, or whatever. But if you go back to the 1800s, women played piano much more than men. It was common, a standard part of the education of a middle-class girl to take piano lessons, not so much for the boy. There's a thing in the British Museum where Charles Darwin was doing the pros and cons of getting married, and he listed under one of the advantages of getting married is he could hear music. Remember, they didn't have radios or television or any kind of recorded music back then. If you wanted to have music in your home, you had to have an instrument, and then you had somebody who knew how to play it. So it meant pretty much having a piano and a wife who would play it, because the men didn't do that. And yet all those women playing, they didn't create any new musical movements. They didn't compose a lot. They didn't develop new styles. And meanwhile, around the same time, the black men in the United States, just coming out of slavery by any measure, much more disadvantaged than those women. They created blues and then jazz, two new forms of music that have changed the way the world heard music. So again, remember, I'm saying the ability is the same, but there's some way in which the male is more driven to use that creativity to make his mark. I'm not going to say even that women are not creative, because women, a woman will take care of her children and will come up with creative little things to do for them and so on. But she doesn't seem to feel the drive to use that creativity to make her mark in society.
At least historically. Now, you could argue that, there's this tension between how much of that was genetic or cultural, how much did culture build on the genetics. Clearly, women today, say in rock music, where there's an enormous explosion of women's success in that sphere. My guess is that jazz will possibly be next. You do see women being more aggressive, being more creative, using the skills that they have, and seemingly enjoying it more than they once did. So doesn't that make you wonder whether some of those changes in the past, some of those roles in the past were quote artificial?
Well, yes, as I said, nature generally builds on a culture, rather generally builds on nature. What's happened through most societies in the history of the world is maybe small average differences in inclination between men and women gradually get reified and locked in by a culture that, well, this is the men's life in the men's sphere and this is the women's life in the women's sphere. Our culture has embarked on a very interesting experiment to try to reverse that, to try to let's erase, if we can, gender differences and make men and women as similar as possible. We certainly, I think, and quite rightly have agreed that it's not fair for people's options and how they want to live their lives to be restricted based on their gender any more than they have to be. I haven't figured out how men could give birth or anything like that. But
no, they're working on that one. They are. I mean, they're all, at least carry the baby for a while. There's some creative, unusual stuff going on there. But I think the issue, which we have to mention, which is obviously in the background here, is that any of these differences are on average. Obviously, there are women capable and interested in doing all kinds of things. They may be very unusual for women, but they might be in the right-hand tail of women in some distribution that we're talking about. And then this more egalitarian world gives them a chance, which otherwise it would be socially unacceptable, or it could be boxing, it could be being a soldier, a police officer. These are all places where women have been eager to have a role.
It's really a terrific time to be a girl or a woman. The society is really encouraging, and the structural barriers and so on are essentially gone, and lots of support. So yes, there's really been great moral progress in our society in that regard.
But you do suggest there's a trade-off, that it can be difficult for men as a result.
Well, yes, those don't necessarily have to be trade-offs. I think, the way we're doing it in some ways, it is to the disadvantage of men. I mean, this latest proposal that they're going to apply that sports Title IX to science and math of women do it. Well, there are some costs there. Certainly
Seems like a mistake.
In college sports, many men were simply unable to play the sports they wanted to because the interpretation was there had to be equal numbers of men and women in sports, or proportional to the campus population as a whole. And again, the difference is motivation, not ability. The girls were just not as interested as the boys in playing sports all along. So try as they might, the universities can't get the women to come out and join the sports teams, and so they have to cancel some of the men's teams. Well, sports, maybe that's a loss, maybe it's not a great thing, but science has been one of the foundations of our nation's success and superiority and its cultural progress. So if we screw that up by essentially driving the boys away, and well, there could be hell to pay.
Yeah, that would be costly. I want to get back to this issue of progress in large groups versus the smaller spheres of intimacy, and I want to do that by getting at the literature that you reference on social characteristics. You talk about, for a long time, there was this view that women were more social. It's certainly a cultural stereotype that women are more social, and that men are more they like to keep to themselves more, don't express themselves, et cetera. Talk about how that literature and psychology has changed over in recent years, and why it's important for the implications for culture.
Well, the assumption that women are more social, I think you may still see that in many places. It was really brought home to me when I received a manuscript to review of making that argument very strongly. I had just published this argument on the need to belong, concluding that all humans, both male and female, one of the core motivational features is this drive to form and maintain social connections to others. So I was a little surprised to hear that men didn't have this or had less of it. And as I looked at the data, well, women are more social if you count social only in terms of forming the one-to-one relationships. That as the relationships studies put it, women are the experts on relationships, and they understand that. They're strongly motivated to form pair bonds with one another and so forth. But if you look at activities in larger groups, if you look at being social in the form of groups and so forth, then males are, if anything, more social. Almost all the activities that will associate with large groups tend to be male activities, whether it's team sports or even scientific economic activities and so forth, military too. Males tend to be much more interested in the large groups.
Men like gangs.
Like gangs too, yes. Yeah. There are some female gangs, but not nearly as many. There's a very revealing study, in people in Chicago, Cacioppo and Gardner and those have this giant study on loneliness, which is a really groundbreaking piece of work. And one of their analyses, they found that, for both males and females, whether you're lonely is determined in part by whether you have a close relationship to someone who cares about you. You have a boyfriend or girlfriend or a best friend or somebody. And, having a few of those makes a few difference. In that, the men and women are the same. What they also found was that how much you identify with your organization, your sports team, your company, your university, this makes a difference in the loneliness of males, but not females. To the female, the belonging to the large group is just irrelevant to whether she's lonely or not. Whereas for males, that can satisfy that need in a way. And I think that again shows that the male, again, the differences between men and women are in what they desire. The males are more oriented toward desiring the larger interactions in the larger social group. I think we also talk at some point, when I review this stuff, there are experimental studies showing the same sort of thing. So they'll have two children play, and then they'll bring in a third and see what the first two do. Well, if it's two girls, they tend not to let the third girl play. They don't want her. They want to keep playing with just the two of them, and they exclude her. The two boys will let the third boy join in. And I'm not saying this to argue in some kind of moral superiority or boys or anything like that. It's just
different.
For girls, they want the one-to-one contact, and adding the third person spoils it for them. Whereas for the boys, it doesn't spoil it. It's fine to have 3 and 4 and so on. So the boys, again, the boys will more spontaneously organize the big play groups and play events and things like that. then the girls left to themselves. When it's playtime, the girls will pair off and pretty much play one-on-one with the same person the whole time. If the boy plays one-on-one, he'll play with one guy for a while, and then he'll play with somebody else for a while, and so on. So it'll be a revolving series of others, or, as I said, we'll get involved in the larger groups. All these show, in something as seemingly innocuous but as universal and meaningful as children's play, the different orientations, the different patterns toward being social. It has nothing to do with girls being oppressed or anything like that. It's just what kinds of things they like to do and what kinds of things are satisfying to them. And, well, there are some differences between what the male finds.
And in those male groups, the men often keep score. Makes a difference. Right?
Yes, I've
very men are very
but
competitive. It's they like those group activities. They like group activities that have a scorecard.
Yes. We all think males watch sports more than women, and they probably do. But I always thought you'd probably find the biggest difference not even in watching a sports game, because women will like to watch an entertaining game now and then and so on. But you'd probably find the biggest gender difference in who checks the scores for a game you're not going to watch. Do you log on or get the newspaper or something and turn to see what the score was of some game yesterday? Because to the male, that's settling which one is superiority, and that just resonates with that very deeply rooted thing we were talking about earlier. You've got to fight your way to the top. We're descended from the males who fought their way to the top because that's how men reproduced, and it wasn't a factor for women. So fighting your way to the top just doesn't matter. The idea of looking up a score on a game that was played yesterday for many women I know, it would just be a matter of silly indifference.
They do look at it differently, in my experience. I have referred in the past on this program to a cartoon, which I'm again going to get slightly wrong, but I'll mention it again. It's a couple getting into the just married car to start their honeymoon. They've just exited the church. The man, in my memory, has his hand on the radio knob, and he turns to the wife and says something like, "Let me just check the score." And the cartoon is entitled "The First Straw." It's really a superb insight into, I think, that difference, and I think it is real.
Yes.
But men like to keep score, and one of the points you make, and let's come back now to the trade and cultural progress issue. One of the remarkable aspects that you've talked about in this conversation, which I don't remember reading in the book, is that it's hard to make intimacy better over time. In your lifetime, you can get better at intimacy. You can be a better friend, a better spouse. You can be a better parent or a child to your parents. As you get older, you learn things, you get wiser. It's hard to improve it over the centuries, though. But those large groups, those large interlocking networks, say, of trade, and it reminds me of Adam Smith's insight that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. As those networks of trade expand, the opportunities for specialization expand, the opportunities for transformation and improvements in standard of living and innovation and technology all become extraordinarily powerful, and it's what's lifted us out of a subsistence lifestyle for the average person in the last 300-400 years. And that's, you argue, the male sphere, and it's a very interesting argument.
Yes, socially it is, and it is the kind of thing you just won't find women building up those networks. And this is the kind of thing that happened over and over, place after place, all around the world. Why? There's no objective reason why women couldn't have built these networks and done this instead. But there are 200 countries in the world right now, but I'll bet just about all of them were founded and built up by men. And
as you point out, that's changing. We're embarked on a very different social experiment, a very different strategy. We encourage now women to do that embarking, right? Many women go get MBAs. They go to law school. They go to college in higher proportions, at least finish college in higher proportions than men, with the expectation, at least on paper, that they will go on to be parts of these larger networks. It seems to be happening to some extent, right?
Yes.
Certainly it's not ruled out. What's your take on that? Are you arguing that it's a a predilection towards what women enjoy, and they just aren't going to enjoy it as much, so they won't be as aggressive in pursuing those links and those large organizations. But they seem to be doing it with success.
Yes, actually, when I first began talking about this, someone came up and said he had recently completed a big study of management consultants, of which there were plenty of successful, both males and females, and they made similar money and stuff. He said, but the males built wider networks of contacts. It was still the same thing. They were showing that greater interest in having a huge network of shallow relationships that is still reflected in the male thing. So yes, women can certainly perform very well in these, and some. Remember too, we're not talking about men are totally one way and women are totally a different way. We're talking about overlapping distributions. What's surprising to me is you still just don't see the women building these up very, very much. They can come into them once the men have created them. That's been really the complaints by the feminists we've heard for decades. They want the existing organizations to change. They don't want just the right to make their own organization and do it the way they want it. If they complain about the way it's been, well, you could create a new organization, a new company, and so on. Liz Claiborne, who died just a couple years ago when I was finishing the book, I think she was the first woman to create a corporation that made it into the Fortune 500.
She got to it was 440 something, I think, you mentioned in the book.
Pardon me?
It was number 440. It made it into the top 500, just sort of barely.
Yes.
But it was in the top 500, and that was newsworthy.
Yes. But just newsworthy because it's so rare. And really, is the marketplace, when you go to buy a toothpaste or something like that, would you say, well, I don't want to buy this toothpaste because it's produced by a corporation that was started by a woman? You wouldn't even know. There's very little bias there. Anybody can make progress and make products and compete in the marketplace. But again, that sort of empire-building mentality that seems to be much more uniquely males. Again, I'm not saying the women can't do it. They certainly can. They just don't seem to be as driven.
Well, there's also a ruthlessness there that may be more male on average, right? Steve Jobs passed away recently, and I'm a big fan of Apple and his products, and I'm a huge respecter of his creativity. We talked about it at the end of the podcast with Frank Rose. And now there are these stories coming out that he wasn't the nicest person. Well, most successful people have a dark side. They do disdain a lot of relationships to be successful. They do shortchange their families. Steve Jobs at the end of his life said he wished he'd been a better father. But most successful people, male or female, have to give up something because of the time dimension that's required there. And there is a certain ruthlessness, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
The market doesn't reward ruthlessness, but it requires a certain level of aggressiveness that often is associated with that character trait, or a lack of kindness, empathy, whatever you want to call it.
And some ruthlessness is rewarded. I mean, when you, let's say you have two corporations, one with an idea of we love everybody and we're going to take care of everyone and so on, and the other, we just want the most competent people and we're going to fire the people who don't perform. Well, you can certainly see the first, more feminine sort would be a nicer place to work, but Maybe. It might not end up making as much money.
Might not survive.
As the other one, it might not survive when times are hard. So if you kind of create the kind of innovation that Steve Jobs did, and again we can say, well, we wish men are more like women, but do we really wish he had been a woman and maybe would not have done those things? We don't. It's hard to point to very many women who have created that level of technological innovation.
And although he was actually, the funny part about this is that he was a great team leader. I'd be interested in how many members of his team were women to really give evidence for this kind of discussion.
Interesting to know, right?
It's only an anecdotal argument, but one of his great gifts was to motivate others to be creative.
Yes.
So it's a little more complicated than just his own genius. That was part of his genius. It's quite subtle, I think. And some of that motivation was quite harsh, evidently. I'm sure he was a tough person to work for. For some people, that was exhilarating, and for others, it was unbearable. I'm sure it wasn't easy.
Yes, if you want to get a long way in a short time, you can't suffer too many fools all that gladly. And I'm not surprised that in his mind he probably wasn't, and maybe had some even more unsavory traits as well. But some of that stuff goes together.
Yeah, agreed. One example you mentioned in the book that I found utterly fascinating, and it came up recently in a podcast that we did with Deborah Satz, was what happened on the Titanic. Talk about that, because I think it's not well known. The example came up in a previous podcast. We were talking about a different type of inequality, income inequality, and how, whether it's fair that the rich get the lifeboats disproportionately than the poor. What do you do if there's not enough lifeboats? Should it be random? And I'm always, as an economist, I'm always worrying about the things that encourage there to be lots of lifeboats. So that's often what people ignore or forget when they're looking at just one episode. But something interesting happened on the Titanic you talk about in the book. Describe it.
Oh, well, yes. It was true that rich people survived more than poor people. There were not enough lifeboats. But the biggest difference was males versus females. And in fact, the poorest women had a higher survival rate than the richest men. So anyone who talks about patriarchy or whatever, I mean, those guys were the patriarchs, the rich upper class white males, and yet they couldn't even get seats in the lifeboats as long as there were poor, impecunious women in line. The women all had to go first. So that's just another, I think, revealing sign. The Titanic was somehow a dramatic example, but more generally, that's just the case. I think most men know that in a pinch they'll be expected to sacrifice their lives to let the women and children survive. Society values the lives of women and children better. We still see also in the news there'll be a discussion of a terrorist bombing or something like that, and then they will say even women and children were killed, which is essentially saying, well, it would have been better if just men were killed, but women, it's somehow worse for a woman to die than for a man to die because her life is valued more. I think, too, some of the tension as women moved into the workplace reflected that women were used to being valued. Women essentially have long been entitled to respect simply by virtue of being a woman. A girl grows up and she automatically becomes a woman, and she's entitled to respect as a woman. In the old male organizations, however, the boys had to prove themselves in order to be men, and you weren't entitled to respect. You had to fight for respect and to earn it. Indeed, a lot of places had those local cultures with put-downs and other signs of disrespect, which I think were functional to remind everybody that unless you achieve and produce and you earn respect, you'll be exposed to this kind of humiliation at all time. And it's a way of motivating the men to try harder and to work harder to prove themselves. The idea in modern organizations that everyone is entitled to respect, I think that's a radical idea, and in some ways not as motivating, not as useful for an organization as saying, well, respect has to be earned. You're not entitled to respect until you contribute something to earn it.
And it's part of the self-esteem movement that you talk about, this idea we're all winners. This is a very modern and perhaps transient phenomenon. Right.
The effect of that on girls could be debated. I think the effect on boys is pretty uniformly negative.
Explain.
Well, I could mention here about a month ago I was visiting a young professor who had gotten his PhD with me, and we were talking about advising students. And I said when I started, I could tell everybody, all the professors, they either worked with only male or only female students, and I wanted to work with both because I want to get the best. And I said over time I kind of evolved a strategy. It seemed like with the women students, you had to be building them up and encouraging them, and with the male students, you had to be pulling them down to earth and deflating them and bursting their bubble a little bit. And he said, yeah, you said that, I remember, and I just sort of thought, well, that's some kind of old-fashioned sexist stuff. But he said, now that he's a professor himself, he says, that's exactly right, and that's what he's had to adopt in his own strategy, too, that telling people, encouraging things all the time, that maybe if you you want to say women have insecurities and so on, then that could be good for a lot of women to some degree. But for the males, there tends to be more narcissism, more overconfidence, so on, especially in the young male. So when you flatter that kind of person, you're not compensating for an insecurity. You're really catering to his worst tendencies. As we know, gender differences in self-esteem are largest. They're not ever all that large, but they're at the largest around the time of late adolescence.
Yeah, I've noticed.
Probably for biological reasons. I mean, what my evolutionary-minded colleagues say is that, well, that's the time when the young male had to fight his way to the top of the hierarchy, get prepared to challenge to become the alpha male himself.
Yeah, so to get in that boat with those other guys to go look for the treasure, too, you got to be pretty confident. It's not fun.
Yes,
you don't really want to get in the boat.
Yep.
Or to go to war. They're not.
Or to go to war, yeah. Or, like I said, or in a small group to pick a fight with the alpha male and try to take his place. All those, you got to be maybe a little more confident than it'd be warranted. Because if you don't take the chance, then you're not going to reproduce anyway. So if you take the chance and lose, well, you're no worse off than you were in a sense. But if you take the chance and win, maybe that will help you to do it. And again, all these things were absent from the reproductive contingencies of women through the centuries. So that late adolescent phase of overconfidence that, especially in my field where we're training people to do scientific research, and it's a very disciplined, slow down, think things through, make sure you've considered every angle, do the interpretation. You better go back and do another study, or you work harder on this. You got to discipline people to work harder, and the young man who thinks he's going to be a Nobel Prize winner in a few years or something, he needs to be brought down to earth and harnessed to discipline and told you've got to earn your place and earn your respect. So telling him, well, you're great and you're entitled to it, which is the new educational strategy, I think that tends to bring out some of the worst traits in males.
Well, in economics, which is there's a photograph I have of the American Economic Association, which is our professional group, meeting with, I think it's President Coolidge, and it's a photograph of the contingent outside the White House. And it's overwhelmingly male. There are two things that are striking about the photograph. One is it's overwhelmingly male. There's a handful of women. They may be wives of the economists. The early part of the 20th century. The other thing that's obvious, they're all wearing hats, all the men, because hats were considered necessary if you're going to go visit the president or do anything formal in those days. So those are two things that have changed. We don't wear hats much anymore, and there are a lot more women in economics. But it is still overwhelmingly a male field, and it's a very arrogant field. And one of the things I complain about on this podcast is the lack of humility among economists about what they know and don't know. I think that's
that would be a male failing.
It would be, and but it's an incentive problem as well. There's a certain incentive toward exaggerating your success and your confidence in your ideas if you want to be interviewed and paid attention to. So there's the hierarchical thing going on there, a competitive thing that I think is pretty not so healthy for truth.
I'm told economics and chemistry are the two fields with the biggest sex ratio right now, the biggest preponderance of males to females. And there'll be others not far behind, I suppose. But I understand it. And again, it's not, I think, an ability, but much more a motivation factor.
Now, there are many other interesting ideas in this book. I'm sure we've touched on a lot of them. I'm sure we'll generate some interesting emails. And the book is has some very controversial things in it. One thing we haven't had a chance to talk about, like to close with, is you talk about culture in the way an economist would, and particularly the way a Hayekian economist would. You see culture as cultural attitudes emerging from competition among cultures. And I want you to talk about that, what you mean by that, and the way at least I've phrased it. And then I want to ask you maybe one or more two questions, and we'll close the interview. But talk about how you see culture evolving and emerging through the competitive process.
Well, culture is. Let me back up a little bit. Culture, I see as our biological strategy. Many people argue, well, is this culture or nature and so on? Well, nature, we evolved to do culture. It's how our species solves the problem of survival and reproduction, which is the same problems every other species faces, but we do it we solve it in a different way. And by culture, I mean sharing information, creating networks of economic trade, as I said, information sharing networks, cooperative interactions where you have division of labor and you can specialize and do things. Well, those all really work, and they accumulate knowledge over time and accumulate wealth and power. Now, groups, culture has several jobs. It's to enable people to live together, to enable them, as I said, to survive and reproduce. But part of that is that you're competing against other groups too. So even if we're talking in a fairly primitive manner of a couple different tribes in the same area, well, one of them is going to get a better space than the other, and competition can take the form of economic or military or some other form, but one way or the other, one culture will be more successful than the other. So cultures have become the way they are, partly because these are the things that worked and that prevailed and that enabled these cultures to survive and become, as we said, for example, the 200 countries in the world today, as opposed to the many cultures that were started and did not make it and did not survive. Attitudes toward gender, for example. Cultures need some people to take chances and to have risks and possibly even to be possibly to be killed in exploration or in battle or whatever. But cultures are also competing by population, remember. So most cultures can't afford to lose too many of their females because it will compromise the size of the next generation.
And those that do, of course, will struggle to compete in war and other ways against those.
Yes,
so it's not just, you explain it very well in the book, you talk about how it's not like the culture sits around and thinks about these things, but that's what emerges through the competitive process.
Right, yes. I was just reading something about the history of China where it had over 1,000 autonomous local sovereign units, which over a couple centuries ended up merging into 7, and then another century or 2 merging into 1. So all those, effectively a couple thousand independent little countries, and you can just imagine how rough a process that must have been, politically and militarily and economically, to merge those into one giant empire. So
I understand how that could shape our current world through past competition among groups and cultures, and that the evolutionary or genetic inheritance we have from that process is going to affect, who survived, and then therefore it's going to affect our traits. It's hard to see how that competition works now, where technology substitutes a lot for population. So to finish up with your earlier remark that we've embarked on this egalitarian experiment to make men a little more like women, or maybe a lot more. We've certainly tried to balance things out. Typically, let's say take it as a given that it's typically to advantage the women, to give them more of a chance to do some things that they haven't done in the past. And you've suggested that may have costs in the case of science. But what are the cultural forces that are at work now compared to then? The United States, for example, is sure, we're in competition with other countries, but we're not at much risk of being conquered the way that cultural pressure would have worked in the past. That's not as common. Do you see culture having a different role than today compared to what it had in our prehistory?
Yes, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Certainly, things
That's a long, convoluted question. I'm sorry about that.
I would have to say countries are still competing with each other, but we can count our blessings that it's not so often in terms of the battlefield anymore. Competition proceeds much more on economic terms, and that is influenced partly by innovation in science and technology.
Let me rephrase it, ask it on more clear. That was a bad question. Let me ask it this way. Let's say we make some of the cultural changes that we've embarked on, and we make them permanent. And let's say they have a real cost. they result in a lower growth rate because, say, we have a different rate of scientific innovation. And this could have many aspects outside of just sexual competition that we're talking about, sex differences that we're talking about. We do lots of things in America today. People push for lots of things that have, say, would reduce our growth rate. Are we going to pay a price for that the way we would have in a small group setting of, in the past where you'd be wiped out? We're probably not going to be wiped out. Where are the market forces that make those changes in cultural innovations costly?
Yes, well, I agree. We're probably not going to be wiped out. Let's suppose we became a second-rate scientific and military power. We could probably continue living on here. We might be more.
We might be happier. We'd have lower rates of heart disease. We'd spend more time with our families. We can think of lots of benefits of having a less aggressive, less competitive world, say, which is what there's a cultural force toward that world. People want corporations to be less aggressive, less competitive, more empathetic, less bottom line oriented. All those things there's a cultural war along those lines, whether it's male, female, or philosophical differences. There's not that much, are there cultural pressures to keep those things from happening?
Yes, I don't really have a full grasp of what, how we would suffer and so forth. I remember visiting Switzerland a year or two ago, and the U.S. was having all these involvements. I think, well, why can't we just be like Switzerland, take care of our own problems instead of trying to send our troops all over the world to fix everybody else's problem? Driving ourselves into the poorhouse and everything else. But most of the political commentators and so on think, no, the idea that America should retreat into itself is just a stupid strategy. That we need to continue to be influential. And, we are dependent on others for trade and for oil and things like that. We might, if we had less to offer because of less scientific innovation and so forth, then we might be in a weaker position, and even economically the quality of our life might decline. But as you say, there might be benefits as well if we didn't work as hard. I'm always struck when I go and live in Europe for a while that they seem to have at the societal level decided that people just in general wouldn't work as hard. The average American gets something like 8 or 9 days of vacation a year and doesn't even take all of them, whereas the Europeans, 5 weeks is sort of a minimum in many countries, and everybody goes and they spend so much time relaxing, and they're not driven to produce as much in their work as we do. It works fine. Well, it's that much perhaps we should really consider as doing it, and yet we see Europe is now not in a situation where other people are saying, "Oh yes, I wish we could be more like Europe."
They're struggling a little bit. That model's sustainability may not turn out to be as high as we once thought. One last question. You refer to a lot of work in the psychology literature, some of it approvingly, some of it less so. What role do you think social science plays in this evolving role of men versus women versus how much of it's just a response to it? How scientific do you think the literature is?
There's plenty of good social science, but I would say in the fields of gender that there are more people with axes to grind and more bias and political correctness, so that lowers the quality of stuff. You are not free to just think any thoughts or follow your ideas or your data wherever they lead. Many people, moreover, specifically choose to study gender. The field is now chiefly dominated by women who have strong agenda that they want to promote in terms of what they think women should be like and so forth. So, I believe in the value of social science and in its potential to do good for society on its own, but I fully recognize that it is sometimes compromised, and people who have want to use, who are scientists second and have political goals that take precedence. Although I respect many of the political goals that they have, they want to make the world a better place and promote equality and things like that. But using science in the service of that, if it starts to alter how you do science and certainly the pressures you put on what can get published and so forth, well, you don't want to allow this article to be published because people don't like its conclusions or something like that. And that does tend to happen. And so I think the science of gender differences is one of the less prestigious areas in social science, and probably to some extent it deserves that. People are not doing it with the dispassionate zeal to find out the truth, whatever it is, that really, in the long run, makes for the best science.
We have the same problem in economics. My guest today has been Roy Baumeister. Roy, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's been a great discussion.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.